Hello. Before we kick off the panel, I just need to make a special announcement. This will just take a minute. My name is Michael Croteau. A lot of you may know me. I'm the guy at the Meteor House table. Just real briefly, I've been doing a website about Philip Jose Farmer since 1996. I started doing his official site in 2001. Started publishing the fanzine Farmerphile in 2005, and that ran through 2009. And the reason I'm mentioning that is the first Farmercon was actually just a gathering of Farmerphile contributors, and we all went up and visited Phil one time in Peoria. And then the next year we opened it up to a few more people. And since we had this fanzine, and we had all these articles and all this artwork, and we were having a convention every year, somebody, I'll blame it on Paul Carey because he's not here to defend himself, somebody came up with the idea that we should give out awards. So we started giving out Farmerphile awards. We had the award for the best artwork and the best article, and we had some special awards. And we did the awards through 2009. And as many of you know, Phil passed away in 2009. And in 2010, we took Farmercon on the road. We went to Seattle before we came to Pulpfest. And we stopped doing the awards. We didn't have the fanzine. We didn't have this steady stream of material. So we just quit doing the awards. And it was about 6 weeks ago, I was sending an email to somebody thanking them for some work they had done for us, for Meteor House. And I put at the bottom, P.S., if we were still giving out Farmerphile awards, you would absolutely get one for all your work on this. And just as I was about to hit the send button, I thought, wait a minute, what the heck? So I deleted that. I sent the email saying thank you. I emailed Wynn and said, I actually pasted what I had copied out of there and said, I think we should maybe give him a Farmerphile award. And Wynn said, absolutely, let's do it. So, for the first time since 2009, I have here a Farmerphile award. If you can see, there's Phil's face etched in it, and right below it says 2013 Farmerphile Award for outstanding work on Doc Savage, His Apocalyptic Life. And this award, this special award, is going to Matt Mooring of Altus Press for all his insanely hard work on this book here. I think half of you have bought. Thank you very much. Besides Meteor House doing the hardcover, Matt's press, Altus Press, is doing the trade paperback, and we'll be doing the ebook. So if you didn't get this one, be sure to get that one. And Matt's still sitting there just looking at me, so Matt needs to come up and get this.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
I don't have anything to say. Thank you. It's okay.
It's okay.
Thank you. All right, so I guess we're ready to get started. Good evening, everybody. My name's Art Sippo, and I'm going to be moderating the panel tonight. This is a panel about Philip Farmer and the Doc Savage legacy. We're going to discuss what Phil had done for the Doc Savage character and for the development of this character into the phenomena that he has been over the last 50 years. I'm going to introduce the members of the panel. Next to me is Rick Lay. Rick is a walking encyclopedia on things pulp, in not only in English but also in French and a little bit in German too.
No, I don't know German.
No, you don't know German, but you know the German characters.
Okay.
Okay, that's okay. And of course, Rick is one of the 3 people who has done an in-depth chronology on the Doc Savage stories. The 3 people being Phil Farmer, Jeff Deisher, and of course Rick Lai. Others have done minor ones, but the work that Rick's done has been in depth, and he knows the character and the series inside and out. We have John Small. John is a journalist from Oklahoma who has been a Doc Savage fan for quite some time.
And in fact, if I remember correctly, it was this book that got you into it. Okay. This is a first edition copy of Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life, which was the biography of Doc Savage done by Phil Farmer, which we're going to be talking about tonight. And Phil has written several things. He's also got an essay. I should mention Rick and John have essays. All of us actually have essays in the hardcover version of the new edition of the Doc Savage biography. Okay. Next to him is Philip Paul Carey. Christopher Paul Carey. See that? You're getting too close to Phil. But Chris, of course, has been doing extensive work in publishing. He has been one of the four horsemen of Farmercon. Okay, the four horsemen are Chris Carey, Win Eckert, Paul Spiteri, and of course Mike Croteau. They've been carrying on the legacy. He recently completed a novel that he had done with Phil Farmer before Phil passed, which was A Song of Quasine, which was the final novel in the Kokarsa trilogy. An excellent book. I've been waiting for that book for 30-some-odd years, and I was so pleased when it was done. Plus, he's got some other essays and that which are contributed to it. He has also written quite extensively on Phil Farmer's one authorized Doc Savage novel, Escape from Loci, and we'll be talking about that later. And of course, at the very end there, we have a man who needs no introduction, so we're just going to go on with the program. This is Win Scott Eckert. Win has been a diehard Wool Newton fan for a long time. I knew him for multiple years because of Wool Newton on the internet before we actually met. And Win is one of the driving forces behind getting this biography printed for the 80th anniversary of the Doc Savage character. And Win has written a number of essays on Wool Newton. He has written many things that are on the Wool Newton site. And he also he has done two novels now dealing with the Patricia Wildman character, who is the daughter of Dr. James Clark Wildman, who, according to Phil Farmer, was the real-life person on whom the Doc Savage Pulp character was based. So Win is quite an expert on the character as well, and we're hoping that sometime in the future there was an unfinished novel dealing with the Doc Caliban and Lord Grunneth from A Feast Unknown. We're going to talk a little bit about that too, and Win hopes to get to that sometime. So I wanted to start off just with some brief introductory notes. Phil Farmer first began publishing about the Doc Savage character in 1969 in a pastiche called The Feast Unknown. This was a book. It was the first Phil Farmer book I ever read, and it was a pretty controversial book at the time because it was very graphic in sex and violence, but it also tried to depict a Doc Savage-like character and a Tarzan-like character as Phil imagined they would really be. You know, what would a jungle man and an urban Superman actually act like in the real world? This story, as I said, came out in '69. The Doc Savage reprints that started the interest in pulps started in 1964. I got on the bandwagon in '65. That was the first time I had read any of the stories. So this first story, The Feast Unknown, I think we have a copy of the book that we can put up. This is not an original copy. This is one that was printed later on. The original copy was published by Essex House, which was actually a purveyor of erotic literature. And I only found it in one bookstore in New York. That was the Bookmaster's bookstore on Times Square, which is long gone. But A Feast Unknown is an important book because it's the beginning of Phil's pulp period. And this is the first major pastiche to include Doc Savage, period. There had been other pastiches back in the pulp days, but this one was a little bit different. And later on, Phil would become very interested in pulp characters in general. In 1972, I think that's right, that's when Tarzan Alive comes out? Right. Okay. Tarzan Alive begins the whole Wool Newton process, and it includes Doc Savage as one of the characters in the Wool Newton genealogies. And Phil promised that he was going to do a Doc Savage biography, and he wanted to do a shadow biography, which he never quite got to. But the Doc Savage biography followed in 1973, which is this one, 40th anniversary for this book, this year. And it was a critically important book because this is the first time that anybody had actually taken the Doc Savage character seriously as a focus of study. What Phil did, at the time that this book was published, only 73 of the 181 known novels at the time had been published. That's 40%. And at the time that Phil had actually written the book, it was a little less than that. It was in the 60s. So at that point in time, we didn't have access to most of the Doc Savage literature. And in fact, certain critical stories, The Devil Genghis, The Golden Man, They Died Twice, and several others that are critical to understanding the character and his development, had not yet been reprinted. Phil actually went, he had a friend named John Cordes, who offered him the opportunity to read the entire Doc Savage corpus from start to finish. And Phil actually did that in the early 70s. If you go back to A Feast Unknown, it is clear that Phil had already done some of the research at that time, because some of the things in A Feast Unknown are going to come back in the biography. So this was not something new. He started doing this back in the late 60s.
Hey, Art, could I just add one
You sure can.
brief comment to that? So Phil had also read and picked up the very first issue of A Man of Bronze in 1933, and he had had his own collection of Doc Savage pulps, which he had read. He had lost those in a flood when he was living in California, and that's why he had to borrow the complete collection from Jack Cordes and read through all of them multiple times in preparation for this manuscript.
You know, at that time, you didn't have access to these. You couldn't find them anywhere. Phil went out of his way to find things that were not readily accessible. And it's a short book. It's only 226 pages. But he did a number of things in this book that are very important and that people in the pulp world need to remember. The introductory chapter on a fourfold vision talks about the pulps and popular literature. And it emphasizes the importance of the popular literature of the time and how it impacts on the society around us. I had forgotten about how much he had written about that until we were going over the proofs of the new version. And it basically is the manifesto of the new pulp movement. And it explains why we're all here, because of the importance of the literature and its appeal. The other thing that Phil did was he took these characters very seriously. He goes ahead and he takes information from the entire corpus and includes it in his storylines, so that we have information here that at the time was not accessible to anybody. This was the only place to find it. The story in The Golden Man saying that Doc was born in a ship off Andros Island, that comes from here. That was something that he had to find in his extensive research. The other things that are important here is that Phil was the first man to tell the world about Lester Dent. Until I read it in this book in 73, I didn't even know Lester Dent's name. I didn't know who he was. But Phil lets the cat out of the bag. There's a short chapter where he talks about Dent in his work. Phil also was a pioneer in the analysis of the pulps and who the authors were. Up until that time, we only knew the house name Kenneth Robeson. The assumption was that Dent did all of them. But I remember when I was reading these books in the 60s, I knew that there were at least two other authors whose style was different that I could pick out. And Phil was the first one to verify my assumption there. But it's the first time that the world knew about Lester Dent. Some of the people in the fanzines knew some of this information, but the rest of us did not. He also makes the first attempts to identify who these other writers were. He didn't get them right in a couple of cases because he was depending on very partial data that came from some of the fanzines themselves. Nobody had access to the information that we now have access to in the pulps. So we have a much better understanding of how the stories were put together. But this was groundbreaking. Nobody else had done this type of analysis on who wrote what pulp. That just hadn't happened. This is an academic breakthrough. He also does the first chronology of the Doc Savage stories, an attempt to put them in some type of order when the stories actually took place. He's the first one to try and do this. He admits in the essay that we've included in the new edition, Phil talks about what he did in writing the biography and how rushed he was because Doubleday was pushing him. But if he had had more time, he probably would have done a better job. But you know, he's the first guy. Nobody else had done anything like that before. And after him now, we have had chronologies done by other experts. My friend Rick, Jeff Deischer, with Eckert has also got a chronology that he's put together on the website over at the Woolnewton website. So again, this was another groundbreaking work. And if you look at this book, it's 226 pages. It's really a small book. Yet it contained a lot of work. There was a lot of love that was put into this. And there was an attempt to do justice not only to the character, to what the character meant, but also to the authors who wrote the stories, to identify them who they were and to let the world know. And he extends the Woolnewton universe, which he had started in Tarzan Alive officially, to include Doc Savage in this. And that Woolnewton universe is a very interesting concept. Bill Maynard, who's out there, made an excellent point this morning in his talk. The Woolnewton universe gives you a framework in which you can write your stories. It gives you a chronological framework. It gives you an ideological framework. It gives you quite a bit to establish your character and your storylines. And we owe Phil a great deal for what he did. And this book was revolutionary. There was nothing like it at the time. Nobody had ever done a pulp character. They've done things for Sherlock Holmes. They've done it for Nero Wolfe. They've done some books on the Shadow, but nothing as in-depth and as varied as what you had here.
You could say Tarzan Alive anticipated this, because Tarzan is a pulp character.
Yes. Well, Tarzan was one of those unusual characters, unusual pulp characters that kind of survived. He's like Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has survived a long time. But as far as taking, I'm not going to say a minor pulp character, but basically a pulp character that was not as big a phenomenon as Tarzan, this was a first. And since then, there's been a lot of interest in other pulp characters, and a lot of this was generated because of Phil's work. Now, I've been talking quite a bit, which is one of my proclivities, and we have a bunch on the panel, so I'd like to have Rick talk a little bit about the chronology, since this is his area, and anything else you want to talk about, because you know so much about this, much more than I do.
Well, just one thing to bring up. Pulp fandom was in its infancy when this began, and while it did spark some critical work on Doc Savage, there was a lot of critical work that was just beginning, totally independent of Philip Jose Farmer. I mean, in fact, I think by 2 months, Will Murray wrote his first article, which was a critical study of Doc Savage, before this book came out. Just to point it out. So there was sort of coinciding at the same time a revolution in pulp fandom. We were starting to take a more critical look at Doc Savage, which Phil Farmer sort of anticipated. His book gets published about the same time as its beginning. And from that grew a lot of great studies we now have of Doc Savage. Now, in a chronological sense, we have to remember that when Phil Farmer did this book, we didn't have the internet really, so you couldn't look up a lot of stuff, and not all the novels were readily accessible. A lot of us collected Bantam books as they came out, and if we had the time, we reread them all, either in publication order or in a submission order that Will Murray had published in a fanzine and later ended up in Writings in Bronze from Altus Press. And you get a very different insight into the series if you read it in either of those two orders. For a lot of us who did book collecting, we would read series, as we collected these books as we went along. And you don't see the continuity as well, you don't see the connections as well. So, I'm sure he didn't have the luxury of reading these even in publication order. So you have to take notes, and you may not observe certain things. And also, since he was under a deadline, I know this because it takes a long while to do a chronology that's almost 200 novels. And even if you're going to realize something very early on, it's not going to totally reflect reality. Because there's no way anybody in real life could have these many adventures and did as much as Doc was supposed to do off stage. Like he's working on Zeppelins for the U.S. Army and inventing some process for extracting things from trees and whatever. You have all this extracurricular activity for Doc Savage, which it would have been impossible for one man to do, to be globe-trotting around the world at the same time. The same with his assistants, who seem to be traveling all over the world doing odd jobs. But we kind of pretend, and we put a chronology together, which is a little difficult because you have to try to count all the days. And I'll be very honest, I got lazy when I did my chronology. I did not go through every Doc Savage novel and count the days. I took his date counts. I altered a few because I noticed some things that made them work longer. It was something like, I think it was in Fortress of Solitude, where there's a reference that they were in the Arctic for 3 weeks or something after the main events happened. And I saw that timeline wasn't reflected in his date count. But that's a very difficult thing to do. I later tried to do it for the Shadow. I don't know how, I just put date counts in. It would take forever to explain how you counted the days. And sometimes, you get these estimates. It's a few days later. Is that 2? Is that 3? Is that 4? Whatever. So, but eventually you can put together some sort of coherent timeline. And why that may be important is for this reason. There's a lot of geopolitical events going on in Doc Savage. Dan had an incredible knowledge of the world. And besides, he early on saw the dangers of fascism. He, at least early on, saw the potential of the Soviet Union as an ally against fascism. He will eventually become an extreme Cold Warrior by 1946 or 47. But you get, besides the obvious things, like the Nazis and the Japanese invasion of China and allusions like that, as we were talking earlier, you get wars in South America that nobody remembers today. You get a villain in The Freckled Shark who's based on the president of Bolivia at the time, which you'll never recognize. You get a situation which later became the basis for Will Murray's novel Death's Dark Domain, where you have a border war that almost breaks out over Transylvania between Hungary and Romania. And if you put these things in a timeline, you'll be able to, when you get the approximate year, you know where to look for. Was something going on in the world around that time? I even remember that, and I owe this to Jeff Deischer. He did a study of a novel called Peril in the North, which mentioned Doc Savage's birthday, and he pinned the birthday down based on references to the midnight sun in the Arctic Circle till around late May. And the plot involved some weird geopolitical event where a dictator flees Europe, and I couldn't figure that out for beans, what that was really based on. I had some wild theories at various times. And I looked at the times that Dent mentioned. It was something like, he mentioned something like exactly 4 or 5 months. And I ended up in, if this was May 41, that would have to be January 41. And I looked at the newspaper accounts and discovered that the vice chancellor of Romania fled Europe, or at least disappeared. They thought he fled Europe. And that was the basis for the plot of peril in the north.
Now, you are able to trace these things down because of the internet, right?
Actually, when I early did it, not all that stuff was on the internet, because the chronology went through various stages. I used to use old New York Times indexes. Now, later I used the, by the time I was doing the second version of the chronology that Altus Press came out with, I used the internet.
But things are so much easier to research these days. Back in the 60s and 70s, not quite as easy. You'd have to use microfiche and things of that type.
Right.
Which is, if you've ever tried to work with it, I remember trying to work with it back when I was in high school. It was not an easy task. And this is the era in which, Phil was doing his researches. So, the amazing thing is that, he made a tremendous effort, even though it was not exactly, probably not exactly as good as it could have been, but he was the first.
You can find things now that he couldn't find, because there's in one section of the book where he's discussing villains, he makes a reference to the Mystic Mola. And he says, the Mystic Mola uses poison from a neotropical rattlesnake. And he couldn't find where that came from. If you go to the internet, you'll find it like in 2 seconds. I think it's from Central America. That's where it's from.
Well, now that highlights, some of the difficulties that Phil had in doing part of this research. You have all these different components that came together here. Now, he also did sequels to A Feast Unknown using the Doc Caliban character. His sequel there was the Mad Goblin. And we'll throw this out on the Mad Goblin character and Doc Caliban. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'll take that one. Thanks, Art. So, just to back up a little bit, as Art had said before, Phil wrote A Feast Unknown, which featured his analogs, or his different versions of Tarzan and Doc Savage, Lord Grunneth and Doc Caliban. And this was his attempt to take on these characters in a way that maybe was not focused on writing stories for the 15-year-old adolescent boy, which was, kind of how the original Doc Savage stories were characterized and marketed. Be that as it may, whether adults continued to read them past age 15 or not, that was kind of the marketing focus on them. And Phil decided that he loved these characters so much, but he wanted to kind of explore what they might have turned out like if taken to sort of their logical and maybe their even satirical conclusion. And so in the original novel, The Feast Unknown, he has them as still having all of their sort of adventures that you would expect, their normal pulp adventures, but there's a secret history subtext to it where they're beholden to an organization called the Nine, an organization of immortals that has ruled the world for a long time. And he uses this as a device to essentially set Lord Grunneth and the Man of Bronze, who were really his two favorite characters, against each other, almost in a sort of Marvel Comics kind of, Spider-Man fighting the Fantastic Four way. Like, who's going to win? Who would be the champion in this mythological and fictional battle? And you can tell, I think, that he had a lot of fun with the novel. It's a shocking novel. If you've never read it before, it earns its controversial status, honestly. And there are some parts in it that are honestly repugnant, but real life is repugnant. And I think that was what he was trying to demonstrate, is what would these characters be, perhaps in some kind of more real world setting. With the Mad Goblin and Lord of the Trees, which were the two sequels to A Feast Unknown, he continued their adventures, but he separated them. I think he understood that that would be going back to the well too many times to continue to have Lord Grunneth and the Man of Bronze together in the novel. So he separated them, and they had their separate storylines where they were battling the Nine, taking place at the same time. So it's sort of a two-sequel intertwined novel, but they're having their own adventures and separate storylines.
We should mention that the original publication was in an ace double.
And one of those wonderful flip books with the gray Moro covers. Just fantastic. I'm sure you can find a copy out on the floor, or two. I think it's really important to note that with Doc Caliban, Phil was not trying to say that Doc Caliban was Doc Savage. This was Phil's own take on a man of bronze, on an Uberman who had been trained from birth to fight evildoers all over the world. But this was not necessarily an attempt to be the pulp version of Doc Savage. This was his own pastiche, and I think that became abundantly clear when he decided he was going to return to these characters in the late 70s and into the early 1980s with The Monster on Hold. And The Monster on Hold is an unfinished novel about Doc Caliban that Phil started. So he's coming back to these characters 10 years later. The Mad Goblin was from 1970. And in the fragments that we have of The Monster on Hold, I think Phil really makes it clear that they take place in an alternate universe. He drops several hints, which if you put the puzzle pieces together, really clearly indicate that they're in a parallel universe to Doc Savage, or really even a parallel universe to his own other pastiche version, Doc Wildman. And so I think he kind of saw the Man of Bronze in different sort of circles, where each one sort of built on or expanded on the prior version, and maybe added, or depending on your point of view, maybe subtracted from the central core version, which is the pulp Doc Savage.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, we've talked about this biography in particular and its influence on people. Why don't you tell folks a bit about your own experience with it?
Well, with me, I was 12 years old when I first encountered the Bantam, the first paperback publication. I had just recently become introduced to the Doc Savage character, so it was still fairly new to me. Now, at 12 years old, I'm already a lifelong bookworm. My parents saw to that. They taught me to read at a little bit younger age than most of the other kids my age, and I was already reading Edgar Rice Burroughs novels when I was in the second and third grade, and didn't quite get out of them. And I kind of came to the Doc books, seeing them in the stores. I'll be honest with you, the first time I really paid attention to them was the first time I saw an ad on TV for Ron Hoover's movie. And that was primarily because I knew Ely from the Tarzan TV series. But I had just recently gotten into the Doc books, and then I saw on a shopping trip with my mother the Bantam edition of his Apocalyptic Life. And I had to buy that. It was I'd never heard of Phil before. I knew this was somehow this book was different than the ones I'd already bought. It had the same logo, but the type of art was different. The author's name was different, but I had to have it. Because when you're 12 years old and you've latched onto a hero, you just got to get everything you can about that hero. And I read this book, and I was fascinated by all the things that Phil wrote about that some of these guys have already talked about and we'll talk about later. But the thing that really grabbed me was the family tree section in the back of the book, where he goes into a lot of detail about some of the other pulp characters that at that point I'd not heard of, like the Spider, some characters that I'd had a passing familiarity with, like, Chuck Ordens and I were talking earlier about the Scarlet Pimpernel. And my only real knowledge of that character at that point, I'm sorry to say, was the Daffy Duck cartoon.
Scarlet Pumpernickel.
Scarlet Pumpernickel. And Pimpernel. And I knew that was a satire. I knew that there was books and movies, but I had not encountered them. I hadn't read any of them. So Phil introduced me to that and made me want to seek those out. There is no way, as a 12-year-old boy or even older than that, had it not been for Phil Farmer, that I would have been interested in a book like Pride and Prejudice, for example. You find me a 12-year-old boy that's interested in that, and it's probably because he's read Phil Farmer or something else that we probably don't want to go into there. But there's all kind, and I would never even heard of books like Raintree County and some of these other, like I say, great pulp and non-pulp literature that I would not have been exposed to. It made me want to seek these things out, regardless of their association with the Wool Newton concept or any of that. It just made me curious about some of these other pieces of literature. So I've always looked on this book as kind of the world's greatest book report, because he not only introduced me more about this character that I've just recently become introduced to, but he opened my eyes to a whole new world of literature. I look at Phil Farmer as the best literature teacher I ever had. So that's kind of a personal thing. It doesn't really have a whole lot to do with some of the concepts in the book or anything. That's what I've always taken most away from it, aside from the fact that it's just a great book about a great character. It just really opened my eyes to literature in general. And I don't know, what can you say? I'm a 50-year-old fanboy. That's one of those things that I just can't thank the man enough for making me want to seek out some of this other stuff that I wouldn't have known about otherwise.
Now, Phil eventually got the chance to fulfill a lifelong dream of writing an authentic, official Doc Savage novel, Escape from Loci. And there's a lot of interesting facts about this. Chris, you've written several articles about it. You might want to talk about that.
Yeah. Escape from Loki, the initial idea for it was originally presented in Doc Savage, His Apocalyptic Life, the Doc Savage biography. And Phil threw in a very tiny tidbit that he would like to write this story one day of Doc Savage's first adventure in World War I, when he's shot down balloon busting. So a lot of fans, I think, were waiting for that to happen for many, many, many years. And finally, in 1991, the book came out. It was spoiled a little bit by DC Comics put out a single-shot annual issue where they took a lot of the ideas from that, where Doc Savage ends up in a prisoner of war camp in World War I, and they used it in this comic book, and not realizing that that was not from the original Doc Savage stories. They read it in Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life, and since this was a fictional biography, Phil would lace in some of his own creative ideas within the story of Doc Savage. And in Tarzan Alive, he did it as well, probably even to a greater degree. So apparently whoever was writing this comic book saw that information and thought it was from the original pulps and went with it in the comic book, not realizing that was actually Phil's intellectual property. So he finally got the chance to do this. It came out in 1991, and it was quite a different Doc Savage novel. He didn't write it with Lester Dent's viewpoint of Doc Savage. You don't see him from a kind of removed point of view. You actually get to see inside of Doc Savage's head, which is a very interesting thing because he's a Superman. How often do you get to see actually a glimpse of what a Superman thinks like? In the way that he portrayed this was, you get to see that Doc is not he does not think two-dimensionally. He thinks three-dimensionally. he thinks in analogies, and you see this over and over throughout the novel. Whenever he is thinking and observing something, there's an analogy there. He thinks it in an analogy. He sees it differently from how an ordinary person would see it. For instance, when he runs across this beautiful countess in the story, I have a description here from the book. He said, "Then there was also, speaking of Helen of Troy, Lily Bugov, Countess Zipu," I don't know how to pronounce that, but she was swaying toward the banquet table. Looking at her hips, he was reminded of the rotary engine of his Newport, his World War I biplane. This image was followed by that of a pendulum, succeeded by a vision of a two-stroke cycle engine. And throughout the novel, there's a scene where he's viewing a battlefield just after his crash, and he expresses it. It looked as if a frantic leprechaun had been digging in it for days, trying to find a pot of gold stolen from him. And there's a description of all the holes from the bombing shells. And it's like, if holes had ghosts, the field would have been covered with a thick gray ectoplasm, phantoms in a traffic jam. So he just sees things differently. There's many more. I only wrote down a couple here to cite tonight. But so in some ways though, he's a typical 16-year-old male. He joined the army. He joined the service early, lied about his age, got transferred to a French flying unit. But he's vain about his reddish bronze hair. His hormones are raging throughout the novel at various points. And he tries to hide his emotions. He observes everything, and so while he's a typical adolescent in one sense, he thinks analogically. He hides his emotions. He sees everything that he sees. He observes it in minute detail. He's got a photographic memory. He speaks 11 languages. He's this weird hybrid. And one of the other things that was very interesting that Phil did in the novel was he has his villain in the novel, Baron von Hessel. He's a German baron colonel who runs this Camp Loki, where Doc Savage ends up and his aides ends up. I should mention that this is also the story of how Doc Savage meets his 5 aides. So where was I here? So what he does is he contrasts Doc throughout the novel with von Hessel, with Baron von Hessel. He portrays Doc, as very almost naive but very optimistic. He's been trained by his father to one day fight evil. But von Hessel is European aristocracy. He looks down on people. I mean, he describes him as like observing the world, the monocle, observing the world through like a microscope, like seeing everybody as like just an amoeba. And so what Phil does is he portrays very clearly von Hessel as the old world man, old European world man, and Doc Savage as the New World American man. Doc has a much more liberal view of things, and he portrays von Hessel as a cynic. And at one point, von Hessel even says that, and he traces the word cynicism to meaning dog-like, which is what it means in Greek. And later in the novel, lo and behold, Doc Savage has a battle with dogs, with wild dogs. I mean, this is absolutely, Phil was being symbolic here. He was showing Doc was having a struggle because von Hessel was tempting him throughout the novel. And this is showing Doc struggling against cynicism. And ultimately, we know that he overcomes that and becomes the Doc Savage that we know. The very optimistic do-gooder wanting to go out and change the world. So there's that. There are other layers to the novel. I've written a number of articles, as Art has said. When I read this novel the first time, I just noticed these very strange things in it, and I didn't know what to make of it at first, but like I knew there was something lurking there, and then I realized that there was a phrase from an Arthur Conan Doyle book. There's a reference to when Doc Savage goes to, he's not Doc Savage yet, but he's Clark Savage, goes to, he ends up in one of his escape attempts in an old abandoned mansion, castle in France, and he finds a secret room in it. And in the secret room, he finds a satanic altar, basically. And on the altar, there's a very strange-looking worm creature, and it's crawling through the bones of a child's rib cage, of a infant rib cage on this satanic altar. And Doc thinks it was, as far as he knew, a worm unknown to science. And as Sherlockians know, and Holmesians know, that comes from a story called The Problem of Thor Bridge, in which there are unsolved cases of Sherlock Holmes that are mentioned. So there was a case that involved a worm unknown to science. And the curious thing about it is that this phrase also shows up in another Farmer story, the problem of the Soar Bridge, in which Farmer took those 3 unsolved cases from Arthur Conan Doyle and actually presented the solutions to them and what these cases actually were, and had the character Raffles, the gentleman burglar, solve the case rather than Holmes, and Holmes was kind of like a step behind Raffles in solving the case, so he never actually does. But the curious thing is that this worm ends up being in this short story an embryonic extraterrestrial. So what we have here is a connection between that story and the Doc Savage story. And so you're wondering, this is very odd, this science fiction element just thrown into this story. And so I kept thinking about it and rereading the novel, and then I realized there's some very strange stuff that happens toward the end of the novel. I'm hoping I'm not giving away too much for anyone who hasn't read it. But at the end, there's a very strange scene where you don't know exactly what's happening between a certain group of characters in this prison camp, but they're playing the game of bridge. And it's apparent that there's some kind of a strange unspoken conspiracy going on. Phil leaves little tidbits of information. And what I finally realized was that I was like, why does this seem familiar? Why does this group gathering and playing bridge? And then I realized that the game of bridge is actually a later version. It's based on the game Whist, the card game Whist. I was like, where have I seen Whist before? Whist shows up as an element in The Other Log of Phileas Fogg by Philip as a Farmer, in which there's 2 groups of battling extraterrestrials fighting a secret war on Earth, and they communicate symbolically through the card game Whist by the hands that are dealt out. It gives certain messages to agents. So what we have here is a cloaked science fiction novel, An Escape from Loki, that Phil has very cleverly seeded into the storyline. That was my big revelation when I was writing these articles.
You know, one of the things that we see going through the Doc Savage corpus, which you see in the later works in the 40s that you don't see in the 30s, is that Doc, as he gets a little older, he begins to question the whole thesis behind the way he was raised. He'll talk about how he's amazed that after the way he was raised that he didn't turn out crazy. And this is very interesting because at the time that the Doc Savage stories were originally conceived by Lester Dent and John Nanovic and other people at Street and Smith, their intention was to create a character who is basically a Superman because he has undergone extensive training and education. This was the myth of the physical culturists that started in the late 19th century and trended right on through. It also had a certain basis in some of the eugenics and the racist policies of the same period. It's interesting, though, that later on Dent began to realize that that really wouldn't work. And Phil, in his story, in the Doc Savage biography, makes mention of this. And, you know, when we talked about this before, do you want to make some comments on that, on anthropology and such?
Yeah, so Phil was an academic, and he studied many different areas with great intensity. He was a very talented and knowledgeable linguist. He had studied anthropology extensively, and I think he came away from those studies with a certain worldview and with a set of ideas. And I think that Phil really came to believe that there was not necessarily a black and white answer to the great debate that has sometimes been characterized as nature versus nurture, and that it was not really an either-or proposition in Phil's mind, but rather, it was the whole exceeding the sum of the parts proposition in Phil's mind. And so, I think that he absolutely was enamored with and bought into the story of Doc being trained from birth for this great epic fight that he was going to take on in his life, and the training was a critical piece of his success in that fight. All of the tutors that he had, all of the academic training, all of the physical training that he underwent on a daily basis, that there was also a natural component to that too, and that I think that Phil probably had the viewpoint that not every single person who would be subjected to this training program would be the ideal candidate for it and would turn out as well as Doc Savage had turned out. And so bringing the nature and the nurture together, I think, was really where Phil was coming from. That this was a guy who was genetically suited for the task, as well as had received all of the training for the task that was necessary.
Yeah, I think the story Lord Tiger also brings that out as well.
It does, with less optimistic results, right? Right. So Lord Tiger is Phil's take on the Tarzan mythos, and what if someone actually put a human being through the training program, or probably not a training program, but through the series of events that led up to Tarzan of the Apes, and he creates this jungle microcosm, and takes this infant orphan and raises this person, Ras Tiger, as Tarzan would have been raised, and kind of exposes him to the things that Tarzan was exposed to. And the result is not a human being that is the idealized Tarzan that we read about in the Edgar Rice Burroughs novels.
In fact, Ras Tiger is the third iteration, his third attempt of the villain to do this, and the other two attempts failed. Part of it being the nurture aspect, but also that just some of these kids were not able to do it. He just happened to hit on the right one for the third one, and that's the closest that you could get. And still, as you say, it wasn't quite what he expected.
Well, it was a crapshoot, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other interesting thing to kind of go back to Phil's worldview, as you point out, he tried several different. He gave the world several different versions of the Jungle Lord or Tarzan. He gave the world several different versions of the Man of Bronze. I don't think Phil saw the Man of Bronze. I don't think he saw Doc Savage or Doc Wildman or Doc Caliban in one way. I think that, and the same thing with Tarzan or Lord Grunoth or Ras Tiger. he saw these characters from different perspectives, and he wanted to explore them from different viewpoints, and mine different pieces about those characters. And I don't think that Phil was really dogmatic that way. I think that he was very open to the idea of there being multiple versions and very comfortable with that flexibility.
Throughout his corpus, there was Doc Ravage in the Swordbreak story. You had Shark the Shirtless in Barnstormer in Oz. He had several other little pastiches that had Doc Savage-like characters in them, and other Pulp-like characters in the very same vein.
You want to talk about Shark the Shirtless one?
Let's talk about Shark. Yes.
He's the most unusual version of Doc Savage. He's in a Barnstormer in Oz. And Shark the Shirtless one is the tallest munchkin in Oz. He also has bronze skin. And he's called the shirtless one because every time he gets into trouble, his clothes, his shirt rips apart. And he had an assistant who's the most ape-like munchkin in Oz, named Lago. And there was unfortunately a deceased assistant named Hammer who was killed by a pig.
This brings up the fact that in the speculations that Phil did, he never really expected that he'd give him a definitive version. He expected there to be divergent versions of the Doc Savage character. Caliban in particular stands out from this. But in Tarzan Alive, there was a little statement that Phil made about some disagreements between himself and other researchers on the Tarzan character, and he said, disagreement is the heart of scholarship. And that's the way Phil saw it. He was happy to have people come in and enter the dialogue and do something different. And we've had a lot of different viewpoints on the nature of the Doc Savage character and his origin. Phil did, he had one pastiche, the Grant Robeson papers, where Doc Savage is actually the character that represents him is Doc Fauve, who actually is bronze because he is jaundiced from being an alcoholic. And he is actually an inmate in an asylum, and it's a very interesting take on it. This is a Doc Savage story allegedly told by Maxwell Grant. So, I think the thing that we have to remember is that Phil was one of the first people to come out and do extensive work on the character, taking the character seriously, and then using versions of the character to explore different assets. In fact, one of the things that's interesting, we mentioned the 1975 movie, which people both love and hate. It has some excellent scenes in it. Ron Ely, you cannot fault his presentation. I think he was beautiful as Doc. But one of the things that people don't realize is if you watch the movie, there are some scenes in there that come from the biography. There is a story in the 1940s where Doc is testing this outer skin that you can wear in the Arctic to keep you warm. So he goes about basically naked except for the spray-on skin to sit out in the ice. The only problem with it is it collects sweat underneath. In the early part of the Doc Savage film, they have a scene that depicts that. And there are several other things throughout the movie that came from here. Now, the reason I say that is because the novel that contained that scene was not reprinted until 10 years after the movie came out. So the only access that people would have had in the early 70s to that story, to that scene, would have been here. And when the movie came out, Phil was, of course, heartbroken, and he arranged to do another screenplay for a sequel. And it's going to be called Atlantic Country. And if you wander around on the net, you can find copies of the script that he had written for it. This is another part of the connection between Phil Farmer and Doc Savage. he actually had written a movie for the character in order to kind of reclaim it and to give us a better storyline than the stuff we had gotten from that George Powell film. So again, Phil was intimately connected with this character. He loved the character very much. And the work that was done here it was pioneering. For a small book, this had a major impact. And, all the things that Phil did, those of us who are Doc Savage fans owe him a debt of gratitude because he helped to develop the character and to set the stage for this character being more widely recognized. Right now, as you're probably aware, Shane Black, who is the fellow who wrote the first 2 Lethal Weapon movies, he wrote Iron Man 3, he wrote a terrific film that is not very well known called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Shane Black is a big-time Doc Savage fan. He's supposedly working on a script. It's supposed to be in the context of the 1930s, and hopefully we may get a decent Doc Savage movie out of this. I think we're coming close now to the end of the session. I'd like to throw this open to some questions from the audience. Talk to any of our experts up here.
The other day, a couple weeks ago, I decided to read through Scattered Logs Go again, and it's been years since I read it. And so when I was reading through it, there was a John Greystoke character in there, and so of course I thought about ours at that point. But I haven't read the rest of the series since years ago, and I was wondering if Scott shows up in any of that.
I don't recall that he does. No.
He does not. The short answer. And actually, I think Phil had intended with that reference to include a historical de Greystock character, which I think some people, given Phil's history with Lord Greystoke, was actually a connection to Tarzan. But in that instance, that was actually meant to be a historical reference to a de Greystock.
Even though they start calling him Lord Greystoke in the...
There's a footnote in the hardcover edition of the book in which he denies somebody who was editing the book was claiming that it was Tarzan, and he rebuts that argument and says, no, this is not part of that. This is not part of the Wold Newton family. This is actually the historical character from our Earth.
He has a lot of the characters in that book rename things to be more in tune with popular culture, because I think at one point the 1812 overture becomes the Lone Ranger overture.
So we might have time for one last question. I want to be sensitive to the next panel.
Yes, sir.
The article is Starlike Night beginning with the first story that dealt with long lives and immortality. And one of them mentioned, suppose that Savage Company is very long lived. It explored some meteor showers earlier in England. Who came up with that?
Well, actually, the characters, the Wildman family, is mentioned in here. They are naturally long-lived people before. The first one is John Clark Wildman, who is an alchemist, who is indeterminately old, but has to be 80 or 90 years old at the time of his death. The Wold Newton aspect, the thing that unites the Wold Newton characters, is that in December 13th, 1795, I can talk loud. The Wold Newton characters were together in one location when a meteorite falls in Wold Newton, England. And for one reason or another, the people who are in this area are changed, and their descendants become great heroes. Sherlock Holmes is included in there, Tarzan, Doc Savage, James Bond, a whole series of them. The exact nature of what that meteor is a matter of speculation, which Phil doesn't go into. He just makes note that these people were in that same location, and for some reason, the effects of that meteor had changed them so that their children would be superlative children. Exactly why is not made clear, but that's something that Phil had developed in Tarzan Live at first, and that's also carried on. That's the basic premise of the Wool-Newton family. The Wool-Newton universe includes the Wool-Newton family at the center, but also includes other characters that are not directly related to the Wool-Newton, not directly descended from the Wool-Newton figures. Okay. All right. I guess that's the end.